Hello and welcome to the Evelyn Y. Davis Studios at the National Press Foundation. Today we're talking about the top 5 journalism innovation ideas of 2015.
The National Press Foundation is a nonprofit dedicated to helping journalists cover complex topics with depth and accuracy. Our mission includes journalists around the U.S. and around the world.
I'm Sandy Johnson, President of the National Press Foundation. With me is Adam Sharp, Head of News, Government, and Elections at Twitter. He was previously a journalist at C-SPAN and NBC. We're also fortunate to have Adam on the National Press Foundation Board of Directors. The topic today is journalism and innovation. Adam, what's the first item on your top 5 list?
Well, I think the first item in terms of the top 5 trends we see in innovation going into 2015 is really this shift from what was a daily news cycle to a 24-hour news cycle, now down to an instant news cycle. That stories are developing in real time and consumers are able to follow those stories in real time directly to the source.
And some examples of that you've seen?
Well, I think a great example we saw just recently when the Senate's report on torture cases came out a week ago. And CIA Director John Brennan did a rather unprecedented press conference for a CIA director to respond to the report. And if you think how that normally would have been covered, he would do a press conference and then everyone would scramble up to Capitol Hill and Dianne Feinstein, the chairwoman of the committee that authored the report, would give her response and we'd see that ping pong go back and forth through interviews and press conferences over several days. Instead, Senator Feinstein live tweeted during that press conference, authoring her response in real time, giving a point-counterpoint to people watching that press conference on TV and seeing the response on their devices at that time.
And how does that affect journalists?
Well, I think for journalists it does a few things. One, it certainly ups the pace of journalism, that the luxury of waiting for a 6 o'clock deadline to file, and I think if we went back in a time machine, no one would ever call a 6 o'clock deadline a luxury, but in the rearview mirror it now seems as such. It does create new opportunities for journalism at the same time. So not only is it that pace to keep up, but also new roles for journalists, that sometimes the role isn't simply to cover the story, write it up, and present it, but to be a facilitator of it, to still be that one who filters through fact and fiction, highlighting those important sources and sharing them with their audience. And sometimes that reporting can be as simple as hitting the retweet button on a credible source, rather than writing a whole story. You know, I'll give an example. The night Osama bin Laden was killed in Pakistan, you know, we heard that the president was going to make an announcement. There were a lot of rumors over what that announcement was going to be. Nothing was very confirmed. And the moment that conversation on Twitter really exploded around that story was one tweet from a man named Keith Urban that said, "I have it on good authority that Osama bin Laden has been killed." And that tweet normally probably wouldn't have gone anywhere, except one journalist knew that Keith was the former chief of staff to Donald Rumsfeld. And it was when that journalist retweeted it that it then started to go viral and be recognized. And so that's where the journalist, with a simple click, added that credibility, validating the source, and passing that quote on to their readers the same way we would have in Wire or a newspaper or on TV generations before.
Twitter has millions of tweets a day, though. How does a journalist wade through the floodgates of Twitter?
So we do have millions. In fact, it's over 1 billion tweets every 2 days at this point. And I think there's a few things. One, they're already cultivating sources and following those sources and so on. So it helps when you know what that needle in the haystack looks like and you know what haystacks to look in. And that is a role I think journalists uniquely bring to the platform as users and provide a service to their readers and followers in so doing. Sometimes, though, the news source might not be someone who is a recognized source before that. And so that's where you're seeing a lot of journalists developing new ways of fact-checking and determining credibility. And this is jumping down the list a little bit, but I'll mention another company called Storiful, which one of the items on our list is talking about this new ecosystem of companies serving journalists. And they've actually built an entire business. They're now owned by a news corporation. And they've built an entire business around fact-checking content that comes from Twitter and other platforms, and providing that service to newsrooms to help surface those needles in the haystack.
The instant news cycle, did you see that play out in Sydney with the hostage taking in the last couple of days?
Absolutely. The tweet volume in Sydney was massive around that. We saw users in Australia and around the world coming to Twitter to that hashtag Sydney Siege to follow the story. Even though it was breaking across the street from a major news organization, the journalists had to evacuate. So in many cases, the closest journalism to the scene was coming from those journalists who were away from their terminals, away from their cameras, but still had those phones in their hands and were able to continue reporting the story. We also saw the story take another chapter after that, where it moved from the hashtag Sydney Siege to I'll ride with you. When a woman had said she didn't feel comfortable riding on the train with her headscarf, and someone else said, no worries, I'll ride with you, keep you safe. And now tweet volume for that is echoing that we saw for the original news event itself.
Yeah, that's amazing. Right. So point number 2, the mainstreaming of mobile video and how user-generated content is influencing that.
So I think, there was, if you think back now, I guess 7 or 8 years ago, you saw many news organizations developing their own tools for surfacing user-generated content. Send us your file at this link or what have you. And that was still a little difficult to go through. And people would have their digital video cameras, but they'd have to download the video, save it in a particular format, upload it if they had a good enough quality internet connection, and so on. So you saw some elements of user-generated video with things like CNN's iReport and so on start to develop. But it's really been only in the last few years where I think mobile video has really gone mainstream and where people are routinely shooting and sharing video from their phones. You look at a platform like Vine, which is a company that Twitter owns, that is short form, just 6-second videos that are, you tap once to start recording, you let go of your thumb, you've stopped recording, and now that video is ready to go. And we saw tremendous Vine usage, for example, in Ferguson during the protests there, and then again in New York following the Eric Gardner protests. On the flip side of that equation, you also have the ability to consume video on mobile devices in a way we didn't have before. So you've seen this in the entertainment space, certainly people sitting on their iPhones watching the latest movie on Netflix, but also being able to see live news in that regard too. So today with news of the Cuba announcement and the presidential address, there was any number of viewers who were able to sit on their mobile devices wherever they were and watch that speech and not have to find a TV plugged into a wall somewhere. Talk
a little bit about Ferguson and all of the user-generated content that came out of Ferguson. How is a journalist supposed to know what's real, what might have been manipulated? How can they discern that?
Well, I think there's a few factors. One of the elements is by exercising journalism and asking the right questions. And if something doesn't feel right, pulling on that thread a bit more, because that's what journalists do best. I think one aspect of platforms like Vine and others, the speed of turnaround helps mitigate things a little bit. When it is a breaking news event and there's video moments later, you might give it a little bit more of a thought of, okay, the time it would take to think about what will we fake and produce that takes far more time than it is just to shoot the real event. But you also ask yourself, is this file footage, essentially? We've certainly seen that in the wake of major storms. I feel like we always see that same photograph of a shark swimming in someone's driveway. But that's where journalists do come into play, and where the community comes into play and becomes self-editing. On Twitter we have what's called the retweet, where you, with one tap, can recirculate that content to the people who follow you, and that's how things get spread. That initial photograph that we've all seen of the U.S. Airways flight landing on the Hudson now 5 years ago was tweeted from someone who only had a handful of followers, but it was such a compelling photo it found massive reach. When you retweet, you are adding some credibility to that and value to that, and the community really embraces quality. They want that because every user finds benefit out of the information being credible.
Eric Garner, that video went viral, of course. Can you share with us what that looked like on Twitter in terms of volume?
I don't have any numbers to share around that. I think what was clear was it was one of those classic news stories of the social age, that it occurred on a public street, but 10 years ago it could have gone completely unnoticed. It was that a citizen had the tool there to be able to shoot that video and distribute that video without having to go home, make copies, take it to a newsroom, and so on and so forth.
Point number 3, new tools, tools that are serving the news industry. You talked about Storyful, but go ahead.
So we talked about Storyful a little bit, and I think when I think of new tools and this new ecosystem of news, it's bringing new businesses into the journalism community, but not necessarily competitors into the community. It's actually increasing the size of the journalism profession. So companies like Storyful, who are surfacing news from social media, Twitter in particular, and adding that extra research, adding that fact-checking, sending out notices of, if you see this picture, don't run it. It's actually from a different storm or a different event. Another company doing interesting work in this space is a company called Dataminer that specializes in event detection. They can basically look at the tweets that flow through on any given day, over 500 million tweets each day, and identify what's different. What's broken away from this pattern? It's like those photos they used to run in the paper side by side where you try to identify what changed. No, the coffee cup moved from one side of the table to another. But they're identifying that through millions of experiments every second throughout the day, and are then able to alert their customers saying something different is happening here. Now, it's still up to the newsroom and the individual journalists to follow up on that, but it's a lot easier to find that needle when you know where the haystacks are.
I understand that these tools are readily available to large newsrooms and people who live in large urban areas. Let's say that you're a journalist in Topeka. Which of these tools would you actually have access to and training for?
So with Dataminer, I know they're working with several large ownership groups, so news organizations that own several local news organizations around the country and are looking to make those tools available to the smaller markets. Not going too specifically into who their customer base is there. But then there are many free tools. For example, TweetDeck, which is a tool available from Twitter. It's entirely web-based at web.tweetdeck.com or tweetdeck.twitter.com. You can access it either way. And what TweetDeck allows you to do is conduct far more advanced searches of Twitter than you would through the normal twitter.com search. So for example, I can create multiple columns across my screen around different topics. So let's say I'm searching for news today about Cuba. I can start by searching just for Cuba, and now I have a column of search results there, just as I would on the website. But then I can add, well, only show me those tweets coming from this particular list of users. Let's say I only want to see tweets from members of the U.S. Senate. Or filter it, just show me tweets from Florida written in Spanish if I'm trying to gauge the reaction of the Cuban community down there. Or even limiting it by only show me those tweets that have been retweeted a certain number of times so I can see which of those tweets are gaining influence. And that is a completely free tool and is incredibly powerful, and we keep adding features to it.
You mentioned Crowdtangle. That's one I'm not familiar with. Could you explain what that is?
So Crowdtangle is another platform around surfacing these news stories, these crowdsourced stories as they develop, for example. There's other companies in the ecosystem, a company called Storify, for example, that takes the other side of the equation, not so much on the discovery piece, but how do you assemble what you found into a story, and taking content, photos from one platform, tweets from Twitter, your own original reporting, and assembling those into a story. So that ecosystem is growing every day. On Twitter alone, there's more than 1 million developers around the world building tools using the Twitter API, as we call it, which is a way of connecting to our systems, and many of those are serving the news community.
Wow, that's amazing. Redefining the idea of syndication. How does that work out?
So I think with syndication, we think back to the classic notion of your former employer, the Associated Press and the wire service of some content gets written once, it gets distributed, people incorporate it into their news product. That is now able to happen on a far more scalable and free way. If I tweet something newsworthy, which I don't do too often, but if I
am the beholder.
There you go. If I tweeted something newsworthy and was relevant to a story that you're writing, you'd be able to, from the tweet, click a button that says embed this tweet and get a piece of code that you drop into your web page, and now that tweet becomes part of your story, but it remains a living thing. Someone can read your story and still reply to that tweet, retweet that tweet, favorite it, or follow the newsmaker. And then back on Twitter, we now associate your story to that tweet and recommend it as a related headline. You can also build collections of tweets, taking several tweets related to a story and embed them into a product. If you have tweeted about your own news content, other people can embed your tweets. And so it's a very lightweight way to take this kind of content, whether it's text only or a caption and an image, for example, and incorporate it across social sites, websites, mobile apps in a readily accessible way, adding to that reach, crossing different platforms along the way. What you've seen a lot of news organizations start doing is use these tools to begin building far more integrated experiences around the news. Those that don't send you to a different place to consume the news and then share your thoughts about it. So trying to bridge that gap between consumption and expression, I think, is going to be one of the big trends we see in 2015, because it brings it back to reading the newspaper at the coffee shop with our friends in the morning and looking down, Dave, did you see this? And so on, because now we're able to do that right from the page, even if we're reading it on a mobile device sitting on the bus.
You used to call those Hey Martha stories.
Right. I think Martha and Dave are married.
Right, having breakfast together, reading the newspaper, right. So data journalism moving mainstream, you're seeing examples of that?
So I think in data journalism, we're seeing that in a few pieces. Number one, I mentioned the Twitter API, a way for developers to connect to Twitter to build tools. It's also a way for developers to connect to Twitter to learn things about what people are talking about, to see what moments they're reacting to. So we see this around major cultural events like the Oscars or the Super Bowl, and being able to see in real time what we call tweets per minute. What were those moments that people reacted to? What were the Hey Martha moments or Hey Dave moments? We can't say, or we don't necessarily have to say, do they like the moment? Are they disagreeing or agreeing? But we can see that this is the moment that drove conversation. We've seen examples of using that data to see where the conversation is coming from. I see this visual on the screen from election night, where we were able to follow the pattern of people tweeting that they voted across the country over the course of the day. And because that data is so readily accessible, journalists have been able to use it to tell even more developed stories. You know, USA Today, which is I think where you showed that map from, also built a visual this year for the election around different issue areas and showing where those conversations were most active. Law enforcement issues, for example. One state talks about them more than any other. Surprise, surprise, it's Missouri. Immigration issues. Most active states there, Arizona, New Mexico, Texas. Ebola was an interesting issue because there you saw the most active state talking about Ebola was originally Georgia, then moved to Texas, then moved to New York, then moved to Maine. You could actually see this water cooler chatter about the news of the day follow the Ebola diagnoses around the country. So at a very low level, the accessibility of data from companies like Twitter opens new doors for telling stories. But that's also part of a bigger trend where you start seeing more news organizations employing data journalists, taking things like open source information from government agencies to better express the history of some complicated issue there. We've seen award winners in our National Press Foundation awards each year, the last few cycles, more and more digging into these large, complex data sets and coming up with startling visuals that bring these 30, 40, 50-year trends to life. And so I think both using Twitter data as well as more and more open data that's becoming accessible on the market being a major part of reporting as we move forward.
I think journalists would be interested in the role that Twitter also has been playing in educating politicians, not just in Washington, but across the world. Could you talk about that a little bit?
So my role at Twitter is part of a team that works with all types of users on Twitter who bring a lot of content to the platform and who talk about the things that our users are interested in. If you think about it, when a user comes to Twitter, whatever brought them to Twitter, if they're interested in sports, they're going to have a better experience if their favorite athletes and their favorite teams are actively participating on the platform. And so likewise, our team works with both journalists and elected officials on how to get the most out of Twitter to better connect with their constituents. Because I think the more those big marble walls come down and both journalists and elected officials become more accessible to the communities they serve, that's a really powerful opportunity for the platform.
You've been with Twitter since 2010, correct?
Yes, just over 4 years now.
Tell us about a few of your Hey Dave moments, stories that you saw explode on Twitter that hadn't really occurred to you as something that would go viral.
Well, it's funny, when you said what was my Hey Dave moment, I didn't even go to a news story immediately. I just sort of thought about the first moment where I thought, wow, this is really incredible. And it was, I was traveling in Germany and standing on the corner of a square, and I had tweeted a picture just because I thought it was a beautiful square, and a moment later a man walked up to me and said, "Excuse me, are you Adam Sharp?" And for one I thought, yes. And it turned out he was a journalist interested in Twitter and who followed me and had seen the tweet come up sitting over there. And what resulted was a 3-hour walk around Berlin talking about the history of the city and of the country and current politics with a journalist who was covering the Bundestag at the time. And it was, for me, in that almost tiny moment that really made me realize how this way of being connected to a global community created a relationship and an afternoon I would not have experienced otherwise. I think in a more Hey Martha moment, another trip, we were down in Melbourne, Australia, and doing a workshop for members of the Victorian State Parliament about how to use Twitter to connect with their constituents. And it was the same time as we had the filibuster in the Texas State Assembly on abortion. And all these state legislators started saying, wait, do you see what's happening here in Texas? And following her tweets and talking about it. And I realized, in what other generation would you have had a collection of state legislators in Australia following a speech, in this case from Wendy Davis, from the Texas State Legislature in real time? In what circumstance would they even know it was happening, let alone watch it live and start to respond to it and start talking about it? And I think we see that echoed in things like the Sydney siege this week. We've seen it echoed, I think, in politics, that it has taken what can sometimes be very localized events or parochial events that strike a nerve, that resonate with people, and turn them into truly national or even global conversations.
Twitter isn't just for young people, of course, and not just for journalists. Can you describe the reach of Twitter, the number of people in Washington that have Twitter accounts? I'm speaking specifically of Congress.
So for Congress in particular, when I started about 4 years ago, so after the 2010 election, only about a quarter of Congress was on the platform. As the 114th Congress gets seated in January, we'll essentially be at 100% of the U.S. House and Senate using Twitter. We closed this year with 100% of the Senate and about 99% of the House. There were a handful of holdouts there, but an election intervened, as they say. And so I think this change, you talked about the age gap. It would surprise you perhaps that some of the best users of Twitter in Congress aren't necessarily the youngest. You look at people like Chuck Grassley, the longtime Republican senator from Iowa, who is an active user of Twitter himself and does his own tweeting. He doesn't farm it out to staff. And I think, for him, it's almost a return to what politics used to be. It is a way of scalably having that retail politic relationship with people. And when I go around the world talking to elected officials, that's a theme that comes up again and again. It doesn't matter where you are in the world. The best way to connect with a constituent, the best way to get a vote is no different today than it was 100 years ago. It's the outstretched hand, it's the look in the eye, it's going to have your vote. But when you have to talk to millions of people, that can be difficult sometimes, which is why we've had these broadcast models of TV, radio, robocalls, direct mail, and so on. And so I think members of Congress find great connectivity with their constituents, that they can now have those one-on-one conversations again and be plugged into those communities, even as they're sitting here half the continent away.
I've been following Cory Booker since he was the mayor of Newark, and now, of course, he's a U.S. Senator from New Jersey. And he actually does one-on-one conversations with his followers on Twitter. Do you see that with other politicians, especially members of Congress or, say, governors?
Increasingly so. And I should also mention that all 50 governors this year had Twitter accounts. I haven't checked the number yet for the new class that was elected this year. But then Mayor Booker, now Senator Booker, was definitely a trendsetter in that regard. I recall back to the Snowmageddon blizzards of several years ago, and a famous tweet of his, someone had tweeted about being on an uncleared street and being stuck, and the mayor writing back, "I will dig you out," and showing up with a public works vehicle there. So it was, I think, not only a profound use of the platform, but probably good politics as well. But this is a trend we're seeing increasingly. More and more members of Congress are starting to use the platform themselves as a way to communicate and stay in touch with constituents. I think it's also a great way for them to show a bit of their own personality. And so you see them tweeting about music, tweeting about the basketball game they're watching on TV, because I think that when constituents realize, oh, it's not just the talking head on TV. It's someone who's spending their Saturday the way I am. I think about, for example, Claire McCaskill, another senator who tweets herself often. You know, we mentioned Chuck Grassley. Interesting story with him. I guess about a year and a half ago now, he had tweeted about hitting a deer on the highway. And it said, "Assume deer dead." And it became sort of this meme for a day or two. It was embedded on several websites. But then people started writing in and saying, you know, ever since they shortened the hunting season, there have been more deer on that road. And my brother was injured in an accident, or my sister's car was damaged. And so he then tweeted, I've heard you, and I've sent a letter to the governor supporting a longer hunting season, and so on. And the tweet about policy had as much engagement as the original funny tweet that had gotten all the national attention, and so on.